Hello again. This is your final lecture on Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality, Volume 1. Today we're focusing on Part 5, which begins on page 135 and ends on page 159. So this is quite a long chapter, which covers a lot of ground, apart from constituting something like the culmination of the book, where Foucault is trying to pull the various threads of his argumentation together. But not only, it's more than a summary, as Foucault doesn't just draw conclusions from what he's been discussing in the preceding pages of the book, but also introduces a couple of important new terms. The two terms that you should take away, the two concepts that you should learn as you read these pages, are biopolitics or biopower on the one hand, and on the other hand normalization. These are the two most important notions that Foucault introduces in the final pages of the book. By the way, when I say most important from what point of view? I would say most important from the influence that they've exercised on subsequent philosophical discussion. Both terms, biopolitics and biopower and normalization, have been regarded as philosophers following Foucault as being very important, as summarizing important insights into the nature of contemporary politics, and have played a major role in philosophical discussions following Foucault. Just to give you one example, one of the most influential contemporary philosophers is an Italian called Giorgio Agamben, who works in the wake of Foucault, who uses Foucauldian concepts in his work. And in Agamben's work, the notions of biopolitics and normalization play a central role. So before I delve into the chapter, doing what I usually do, that is to say highlighting certain passages for you and commenting on them, I want to give you something like a general summary of what's going on in the chapter so that you have a point of orientation and know what to concentrate on, also as you read these pages yourself. I'll try to summarize these two central notions that I've now been talking about by beginning with a reference to a different work of Foucault's. This first volume of the History of Sexuality was published in 1978. Just a few years before that, in 1975, Foucault brought out a different book under the title Discipline and Punish. Surveiller et punir in French. Discipline and Punish. Discipline and Punish opens with a totally shocking scene. Foucault describes, and he's obviously taking a great pleasure in shocking the reader, in having this kind of shock effect as he opens the book. He describes how in the middle of the 18th century, at the center of Paris, a man who had attempted to take the life of the king was put to death. But put to death not, by hanging or any kind of simple way, but through an excruciating, brutal, long process of torture. I'm not going to go into details here. Okay. What Foucault tries to do with this opening of the book of Discipline and Punish is he wants to illustrate how political power used to work in, not even pre-modern Europe, middle of the 18th century, that's already modernity. How political power used to operate, how it used to function until quite recently, really. That is to say, how is it that it used to function? Well, by a punctual application of overwhelming force and violence when the rights or the life of the sovereign, king, count, whatever, were threatened. That's to say, power was punctual and overwhelming. It was brought to bear on, it showed itself in the ability and right of the sovereign to take the life of a subject. And the life of the subject could be taken in two contexts: directly as in the case of this would-be assassin of the king who is tortured and put to death. His life is taken brutally and directly because he threatened the life of the sovereign, of the king. The life of the citizens of the subjects could also be taken indirectly, because in the aristocratic system of medieval but also early modern Europe, the sovereign had the right to call his subjects into service in cases of war. And of course this military service wasn't a direct putting to death of the subject. In fact, the hope was, of course, that the subjects wouldn't die, that the king's army would prevail, but it was nonetheless an indirect putting to death, in that military service always holds the risk of death. Military service, the king had the right to call his subjects to military service in cases where his realm was threatened. Realm, his rule over a particular area of land, was threatened. Okay, that's how power used to be exercised. Now, is power still exercised in like this today in our contemporary modern Western societies? No, no. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault contrasts this kind of horrific public execution with modern modes of punishment, incarcerating people. But that's, of course, not the subject matter of the history of sexuality. In the history of sexuality, Foucault focuses on the way in which modern power, instead of working by what he called subtraction, imposing death on people, taking life away from them, power functions in the mode of this biopower as an ordering of the forces of life. So it is not negative and violent, but it is positive, is brought to bear on life by managing it, ordering it, distributing it. Okay? And it does that through normalization. Normalization is the application of norms and standards to all areas of life. Okay. Where in modern societies and under modern governments can one see examples of this biopower? Well, examples of the biopower are modern state healthcare systems. So there the government, instead of being the agency that imposes death for transgressions, is the agency which, well, applies norms of health to a population. Keeps the population within certain norms of health. Other examples would be public housing, or even government-mandated standards of construction. Because you see, what are these, let's say, government-mandated standards of construction about? They're about ensuring the life, the well-being of the population. And this is done by normalizing, for example, standards of housing, stipulating that a room has to have a minimum of, such and such a square footage, stipulating that there has to be a minimum of ventilation in a room. By the way, interesting little point, all modern, recently constructed houses in Ireland have to have ventilation in every room. I'm sure you've noticed this. There is, even in this room, you can see it behind me. Do you see the brass plate? No, it's on the other side actually. There behind me. That's ventilation for this particular room, which I've blocked off. Why have I blocked it off? Because, particularly in the winter, it lets all the cold air in. The point, however, is to ensure that people don't get, historically, a big problem in Ireland was tuberculosis, and tuberculosis came from, stale air, not enough fresh air, etc. Another problem was the presence of fireplaces in many rooms, which could lead to carbon monoxide poisoning, hence also the need of ventilation. So that's just one example of normalization, imposing norms on all areas of life, health, construction, etc., in order to ensure that people are able to live, in order to ensure their well-being, in order to make sure they're able to flourish at the level of their very life forces. So now I will get into my usual discussion of the text of the book. I hope that this introduction has helped you understand the two central concepts of the fifth part of the history of sexuality, at least in a preliminary way. If you look at page 136, Foucault contrasts this older type of power with the new type of power, and I'm just going to read you a couple of quotations to illustrate the to illustrate the way in which Foucault to show you the concepts that Foucault uses in order to describe these two forms of power. 136 towards the center of the page. The older type of power, the type of power he describes in the first page of Discipline and Punish. Power in this instance was essentially a right of seizure. Or a few lines before that he says it was a subtraction mechanism. So you see, it was negative, a right of seizure, subtraction mechanism. You transgress the law, I have the power to punish you, and the punishment consists in the case of serious transgressions, my imposing death, my taking your life. Now he says that's not how power operates anymore in our modern Western societies. Rather, we're dealing with, again, 136, a little bit further towards the bottom of the page, we're dealing with a power bent on generating forces, making them grow and ordering them, rather than one dedicated to impeding them, making them submit or destroying them. And again, if you turn to page 137, you will find there another description of this more modern type of power. Foucault says, again, 137, just a few lines from the top of the page, we're dealing with a power that exerts a positive influence on life, that endeavors to administer, optimize, and multiply it, subjecting it to precise controls and comprehensive regulations. There you can already see this term normalization appearing on the horizon. Foucault describes genocide as the paradigmatic manifestation of war in the time when power is a power over life rather than the power to impose death. Now you might say, well, you know, genocide is a type of war that's very, very bloody, that involves a lot of death. So what does it have to do with this modern way of government exercising power over the promotion of life? Well, genocide has to do with maximizing the life of the population that is under your control by destroying the life of other groups of population. So what, according to Foucault, animates genocide, and what, according to him, makes genocide the paradigmatic form of war in the contemporary world, is the fact that it comes from the desire to maximize the life of one's own population. He writes on page 137, if genocide is indeed the dream of modern powers, this is not because of a recent return of the ancient right to kill. It is because power is situated and exercised at the level of life, the species, the race, and the large-scale phenomena of population. Remember that many of the, certainly the most horrific war of the 20th century, the Second World War, was triggered by Hitler and his fantasies of creating more space for the life of the German population, while destroying other populations, which the Nazis thought were preventing the German population from maximizing their own life forces. But Hitler is only one example of genocides. As you know, there have been others, both before and after Hitler. So, for example, famously the Rwandan genocide in the Africa of the 1990s. So if genocide is, if you will, the negative manifestation of biopower as at its worst, what is the standard way in which biopower manifests itself, in which modern governments, rather than exercising their power by cutting off the life of transgressors, exercise their power by promoting the life of their populations? Well, this promotion of the life of the population happens in two ways, which Foucault describes on page 139. He distinguishes there what he calls an anatomopolitics of the human body, in italics, from the regulatory controls that come with the biopolitics of the population. So this bio power has two, if you will, branches. The one branch is this anatomopolitics of the human body, the other is the biopolitics of the population. What is an example of this anatomopolitics of the human body, where the government tries to structure the life of its citizens at the level of their, well, anatomopolitics, at the level of their anatomy? Now just think about that seriously for a second. So Foucault's claim is modern governments function by structuring the life forces of their citizens at the very level of the way in which their anatomy functions. You would say, wow, that's just completely crazy. But then look at when you look at the examples that he gives, you will begin to understand. He speaks, 140, of universities, secondary schools, barracks, workshops. These are examples of where the anatomopolitics of the human body occurs, where governments shape the bodies of their subjects. Well, think of the seating in a secondary school, the way in which the rows are aligned with the little chairs in front of the desks or behind the desks, whatever perspective you take. Note how that trains the body of the student to assume a certain posture in relation to the teacher who teaches. Take the example of barracks. Well, where obviously soldiers are trained to assume certain postures with their bodies as they march, as they hold the rifle, as they greet the senior officers, etc., etc. All these are ways to structure the life forces of citizens. The third example that he gives is, or is it the fourth, is workshops. Think of something like, this is almost a little bit old-fashioned now, but think of factories with the conveyor belts, where workers are well trained to assume certain postures in relation to what they have to assemble, in relation to the conveyor belt, in relation to each other, so as to be able to perform their work. That's what he means by the anatomopolitics of the human body. So power exercises itself at the level of the individual body and the way in which it comports itself. Okay? The second is the second aspect of this biopower is what he calls the biopolitics of the population, of which he gives the following examples on page 140: birth rate, longevity, public health, housing and migration. Well, I already talked about that a little bit a few minutes ago, so perhaps I don't have to elaborate in too much detail. So governments, on the one hand, take an interest in each individual subject or citizen and the way in which the body of that citizen is structured. On the other hand, they also take an interest in the life forces of the mass of the population, because modern governments are intensely interested in, not just, by the way, intensely interested in, but also intensely interested in regulating, in normalizing, in bringing standards to bear on birth rates. Governments get really, really upset if the birth rate is too low, because then, well, a certain equilibrium in the population is no longer there. Not enough people to pay into the pension plan, not enough workers, etc., etc. And by the way, if the birth rate is too low, then measures are taken to encourage immigration. If the birth rate is too high, measures are taken to discourage immigration. So the population flows generally become of interest. Longevity, well, making sure that the money that has been invested into the population through lifelong health care produces good results. Public health and housing, I already gave you the examples of that. Our current COVID crisis, of course, is the quintessence, is a paradigmatic example of the way in which a modern government functions. Again, sorry for being a little bit repetitive, go back to the opening page that I summarized for you of discipline and punish, and of the way in which a king functioned in 18th century France. Brutality, violence, public torture. Compare this with, so death is imposed for transgression. Compare this with the way in which the modern Irish government, other European governments, American governments worldwide, Chinese government, function in the face of the COVID crisis. Well, imposing rules to make sure the life forces of the population are able to unfold without being cut off by death or illness, right? And by the way, anatomopolitics of the human body. Think about going to Dunn's or to Tesco's or Lidl. I'm not trying to make advertisement here for the particular supermarket chain. You obviously notice the yellow lines on the floor, making sure that people keep this distance of 2 meters from each other. That's an example of an anatomopolitics of the human body. So there, the government, as it exercises its biopower, as it tries to safeguard and promote the life of its citizens, it trains our bodies to assume a certain stance in relation to each other, and that's this 2 meter distance. And you know what's interesting is the question as to whether this kind of anatomopolitics of the human body in terms of the social distancing will stay with us once the crisis is over. Will our bodies have been trained to such an extent that we will now always keep a distance from each other, seeing each other potentially as these walking bundles of viruses? So, I move on a little bit. I'm now on page 121, where Foucault discusses the relationship between this biopower and capitalism. Or rather, I should say it starts at the bottom of 140. This biopower was without question an indispensable element in the development of capitalism. The latter would not have been possible without the controlled insertion of bodies into the machinery of production and the adjustment of the phenomena of population to economic processes. I don't really want to paraphrase that because it's extremely well said, and any paraphrase will just water it down with kind of my blah blah. It's very, very well said. Just read the sentence and study it, and I think you'll understand what it means. On the next 2 or 3 pages, 141, 42, 43, Foucault offers us explicit definitions of this, of the way in which he understands the terms biopolitics and biopower. And I would like to draw your attention to these. I've explained the terms, but I would like to draw your attention to these precise definitions that he gives. So 143. There's a definition of biopower. 143. It's something like 5-6 lines down from the top of the page. He says he uses the term biopower to designate what brought life and its mechanisms into the realm of explicit calculations and made knowledge power an agent of transformation of human life. Now, 2 other ways in which he puts this. On these pages, which pages? 41, 42, 43. He describes biopower as the entering of life into history. So you see, life becomes, what does it mean that life becomes a part of history? It becomes part of the explicit way in which human beings plan their own destiny. That's perhaps what history means. And before this biopower, before modern governments, of course human life existed, well obviously, but not as part of this, of the historical factors that human beings thought they could influence and understand. It was something that remained outside of history. Life is given to us, or it's taken away by illness, by whatever, and it's not something that we ourselves, as life, now I can give a shape to my life, but as life force, not something that we ourselves could give shape to, and therefore not part of human history. Another way in which Foucault puts this, or another way in which he tries to explain this rise of biopower, page 143, is in terms of Aristotle. For millennia, man remained what he was for Aristotle, a living animal with the additional capacity for political existence. Zoon politikon. Zoon means living thing, animal, and then politikon, living in a polis, living in society. So for Aristotle, we live, and then in addition to that, what makes us human is the fact that we live in a politically structured society, which worms and cats and monkeys don't do. Modern man is an animal whose politics places his existence as a living being in question. I think I read that too quickly or not clearly enough. Modern man is an animal whose politics places his existence as a living being in question. So in the modern society, it's not that we live and then we're also political beings, but our very lives become part of the political process. On page 144, Foucault contrasts the way in which the older type of power, the power that manifested itself as a right to impose death, is different from the biopower, and he contrasts the notions of law and normalization. So the older type of power functioned through law. What does law do? Law puts a boundary to the scope of legitimate action that we are entitled to engage in. Once we transgress the law, a sanction is imposed. And if the transgression is too radical, I mean, if I try to kill the king, for example, then the penalty that is imposed is the subtraction of life itself. In other words, it's death. Normalization doesn't function through the imposition of boundaries, leaving the part of my existence or of the population's existence that is not directly, what should I say, that occurs within the law, leaving that unaffected, but rather tries to permeate the entire area of life with standards and norms. That's normalization. Okay, I hope that's not too abstract. I will give you another example. I'm not going to talk about the kind of torturing and killing of people again, in medieval and pre-modern society. I think you've understood that. Hand in hand, however, with this with this medieval and pre-modern form of power, went the reality that governments they had these spectacles. They put in place these spectacles of excessive violence, which overwhelmed people and gave them the impression, oh my gosh, the king is this person who, when threatened, will impose this absolutely brutal and unspeakably horrible punishment. However, the reality is that until quite recently, governments were relatively powerless. That's to say, in Europe, perhaps governments were able to assert their authority in major population centers. The King of France had control over Paris. Did the King of France really have control over, all the forests of France, the whole French countryside? No. He didn't have a sufficient police force. He didn't have sufficient surveillance to exercise power in every, in every little corner of the realm that nominally he was governing. Compare that with the modern government, and I think then you will understand what normalization is. The modern government, and not through the presence of police, but through the presence of, let's say, electronic surveillance. You walk in the streets of Dublin, well, some sensor measures the footfall. A camera looks at the people walking in the street, and someone in some control center, perhaps the Garda headquarters, looks at monitors corresponding to cameras installed over Dublin to make sure, people are not getting into fights, to make sure if there's a traffic accident that, Garda can immediately rush to the scene, etc., etc., etc. So that's the type of, or internet traffic. The way in which, I'm not sure that's a reality in Ireland, but the way in which in countries like the United States, internet traffic, email messages are constantly monitored by the government in order to find, where terrorists are planning, their next attack, or where subversive activities are going on, etc., etc. That's a kind of surveillance of every aspect of society, and it's a kind of penetration of normalization into all areas of society that would have been inconceivable. And by the way, the examples I just gave you were perhaps still too negative examples. They were examples of laws being imposed. Think also, but I mean, what else is normalization? Think of the way in which a piece of meat was bought from a butcher 200 or 300 years ago. You go to the local butcher sells you a piece of meat, and whether the piece of meat is a good one, it's really fresh, it's really tender, blah, 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 is between you and the butcher. Okay. Now you go to the butcher has already been inspected 50 times by somebody from the HSE or whoever, some government authority, certifying that the butcher keeps certain standards of cleanliness. The steak that the butcher sells you can be traced back to the farmer who raised the cattle. It can be traced back to the slaughterhouse, which was subject to inspection. And again, you see inspection, not simply enforcement of law, but normalization, making sure it's kept properly clean, making sure that the people working there are not ill, etc., etc. That's normalization. So it's a much better example than the example which I gave you a minute ago, the example of cameras in the streets of Dublin. That could also be a form of normalization, in particular if it's not simply to make sure that people don't commit crimes, but to normalize their behavior in the first place. So not simply to send the guards somewhere where there's a fist fight, but to make sure, cameras, so let's behave normally in the first place. So that's how this normalizing power works, not by sanctioning transgression, but directing life forces in such a way that transgressions don't occur in the first place. I think you're getting, I think these examples are helping you to understand first how this biopower works, secondly, what normalization. This part of the book, part 5, there are 2 more sections to it. We've now completed reading the first section. So we're now on page 145. And I think I've explained the major arguments, the major concepts of those pages to you. From pages 145 to 150, on those pages, Foucault returns to the question of sexuality, and in the final pages, 150 to the very end, he makes an objection to himself, which is a very typical rhetorical move. He loves to do that at the end of his book. So these are 2 parts that we're still going to discuss. So he returns to sexuality. What's the central thesis here? In these pages, again, in order to not to lose you, 145 to 150. What's the central point here? It's very, very interesting. The central point is that the old form of power functioned through blood. The new biopower functions through sex. How does he put that? 148. I'll quote a couple of striking phrases to you. 148, just a few lines from the top of the page. He says that a substitution of sex for blood has occurred in the way in which modern society works. And then just a few lines further down, again, still on page 148, we've moved, he says, from a symbolics of blood to an analytics of sexuality. From a symbolics of blood to an analytic of sexuality. So the older type of power was associated with blood in 2 ways. A, the older form of power was aristocratic. And aristocratic means in order to hold power you have to have that famous blue blood in your veins. So in that way power was connected with blood. If you have the right blood flowing in your veins, you're a lord. If you have the wrong type of blood flowing in your veins, you're just a serf. Okay, so power and blood. But then also, if the right type of blood was circulating in your body, then how did you exercise your power? By making blood flow, right? So by, when transgressions get serious enough, imposing death on people, or by calling people to military service on your behalf to defend your realm, which again involves the shedding of blood. Modern power doesn't work through blood, it works through sex. It's interesting. It's kind of a shocking thesis, something shocking to say. How does he argue this? Well, modern biopower works through the anatomopolitics of the body and through the biopolitics of the population. And according to Foucault, 146, 3 lines from the top of the page, sex was a means of access both to the life of the body and the life of the species. or 147, at the end of the first paragraph there, broadly speaking, at the juncture of the body and the population, anatomopolitics of the body, biopolitics of the population, sex became a crucial target of a power organized around the management of life rather than the menace of death. So what does that mean? It means that for modern governments and the way in which they exercise their power, the sexuality of their subjects, of the citizens, is of intense interest and comes to be subject to normalization for two reasons. In order to govern the life forces of individual bodies, on the one hand, and on the other hand, to manage populations. And both, it's clear how the management of populations is connected with sexuality, that doesn't require any explanation, but also the way in which we live our lives at the physical level is connected with the way in which we live our sexuality and the way in which this is normalized, the way in which this is conceptualized in contemporary society. In case this last point is not yet sufficiently clear, just ask yourself this: why is it that the whole question of our sexuality has become a political issue? And it would be one thing to say, you know, one person has such and such a so-called sexual orientation, the other person has a different one, one person is married, the other person, you know, just lives with a partner, blah, blah, blah. I mean, all these are ethical, interesting questions. Why are these political questions? And I think there you can see how political power comes to be interwoven in contemporary government with these basic life forces of sexuality. So that now the question of equal rights for gay people, the question of making sure there's no discrimination against trans people, sex education in schools, etc., is not again just a matter for individual citizens to deal with in their relations with each other, but is something that is, well, again, you see the term here is normalized. I mean, sex education is a very good example of that. It's not simply that parents tell their kids about, what sex is about, but rather this has to be done at the level of something like official instruction. I think there you can see how politics and sex interweave. I think there you can see that Foucault has a point, that there's something there that he's identifying. The final pages are a bit difficult, 150 to 159. So first of all, the literary form is not difficult, but it's fun. It's something that Foucault likes to do, make an objection to himself at the end of a book. Or sometimes he does it in the preface to a book. People are going to say that I am dealing in a historicism which is more careless than radical. Historicism means making everything subject to history, claiming that everything that we are as human beings is subject to historical and cultural and social variation. That's what historicism means. People are going to say that I am dealing in a historicism which is more careless than radical. So people are going to say, well, you're quite careless in what you're arguing here. By the way, one could understand why people would say that, because he packed so many controversial theses into just 150 pages. Not everything is argued in the detail that's required, but of course that it was his plan to do this in volumes 2, 3, and 4. Only, and I mentioned this to you before, what happened is that he ended up going in a somewhat different direction in volumes 2, 3, and 4. Anyway, I'm dealing in a historicism which is more careless than radical, that I am evading the biologically established existence of sexual functions for the benefit of phenomena that are variable, perhaps, but fragile, secondary, and ultimately superficial, and that I speak of sexuality as if sex did not exist. And then he actually gives a large, fictitious quotation of somebody objecting to Foucault. Okay, so the point that he makes here is the book is a book about the history of sexuality. Okay, it's also a book about power. We now know that. The person objecting to Foucault says, okay, I mean, let's accept that sexuality is something, is this concept which expresses the insight that the way in which we live our sex depends on the society in which we are, the historical period in which we live, blah, 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 all kinds of social, cultural, and historical factors. But what that doesn't change is the fact that, well, you know, human beings are sexed. We have sex, okay? And Foucault answers that. What is his answer? Well, I'll read it to you. It comes on page 155. Well, and 157, I mean, there are a couple of interesting quotations. Perhaps I'll read this quotation to you first. It's on 157. 157, towards the center of the page. He says, sex is historically subordinate to sexuality. What does he say on page 155? 155, about the center. Sex, then blah 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 in parentheses, is doubtless but an ideal point made necessary by the deployment of sexuality and its operation. We must not make the mistake of thinking that sex is an autonomous agency which secondarily produces manifold effects of sexuality over the entire length of its surface of contact and power. On the contrary, sex is the most speculative, most ideal, and most internal element in a deployment of sexuality organized by power in its grip on bodies and their materiality, their forces, energies, sensations, and pleasures. The best way to explain this is by reference to Immanuel Kant. And I can refer to Immanuel Kant because you studied his thought in some detail in modern philosophy, and even in our class, when we talked about Heidegger, there were multiple references to Kant. As you know, Kant has this idea according to which all we know of reality is, well, in his technical terms, the phenomena and not the noumena. Another way of putting it is to say that what we experience of the world is never the thing in itself. What is a tree in itself? What is a tree considered outside of the way in which human beings perceive and experience the tree? The answer is not to say there's no tree. The answer is to say how the tree is in itself, abstraction made from the human perception and the kind of processing of the incoming sense data, the sense data that come in from the tree, the processing of those data in the human mind. What the tree is, apart from that, we don't know. That's what Kant means when he says we don't know the thing in itself. Foucault is saying this in relation to sex. He's saying, when you can say in the abstract, well, of course, all human beings, like all animals, you know, have some kind of sex. They have sex. They are sexed beings. Fine. Look, I mean, what would it mean to deny that? But the question is there something like a pure, authentic sex that's accessible to us outside the way in which this is lived, construed, conceived of, normalized, regulated, etc., in a society, in a particular historical situation? So is there sex apart from sexuality? And he wants to say no. That's the main point of these last few pages. So he wants to refute people who say, well, you're talking about sexuality, but what's at the root of sexuality, namely sex, that you're not talking about. And Foucault's answer is, look, the root doesn't exist outside of its construction. There is no sex outside of sexuality. And how do we see this? Well, we see it through the way in which the very way in which we live our sexuality has become a defining trait of who we are, in ways that are totally unprecedented in human history. And this shows that there is no such thing as a sexuality that's free of historical and social construction. I want to draw your attention, perhaps that's the final remark that I'm going to make, I'll draw your attention to an interesting passage on pages 155 and 56. Again, I'm going to read it to you. It is through sex, in fact, an imaginary point determined by the deployment of sexuality. It's interesting. It's like the thing in itself. Sex is an imaginary point. I would say, well, strange. But if you understand it in this Kantian way, it's not that strange. It is through sex that each individual has to pass in order to have access to his own intelligibility. So we understand who we are through sexuality, to the whole of his body, to his identity. Well, right. Hence, identity politics. in contemporary society. You see, I referred a few minutes ago to this interweaving of sexuality and politics in our society, which is unprecedented. Through a reversal that doubtless had its surreptitious beginnings long ago, it was already making itself felt at the time of the Christian pastoral of the flesh, we have arrived at the point where we expect our intelligibility to come from what was for many centuries thought of as madness. So kind of, why madness? Well, because, let's say, certainly in the Middle Ages, in patristic times, sex was seen as that area where we can't exercise our reason. So in some way, sex makes us into animals. Hence, by the way, also the association of sin with sex. The idea being that we lose control to such an extent that we're not rational anymore. The passions take over, and therefore sex is that which is properly really not even human. So that's how it used to be seen. Before it was absorbed into kind of biopolitics. So sex was seen as the opposite of being intelligible to ourselves. So when I, let's say, succumb to sexual passion, that means I'm not really myself. I'm losing myself in this moment, right? Whereas now, so that's, again, not even pre-modern, medieval, and even still early modern. Now, it's not that I lose myself in sexual activity, because I'm no longer properly human, passions are going on, I'm not being reasonable, but now I am who I am through to the kind of sexual activity that I prefer and in which I engage, etc., etc. And that, according to Foucault, is this kind of characteristic way in which sex comes to be configured at the time of biopolitics. So what's the conclusion then on page 159? Well, Foucault wants to say, if we want to be kind of revolutionaries or radical critics of contemporary society, don't assume that the way to be radical is to affirm sex and sexuality, which is still a kind of tendency that's present in contemporary society. You know, this idea that we still have to liberate ourselves more from all kinds of sexual constraints, live our sexuality more openly, more genuinely. Foucault would say, well, that's not, you see, that's still remaining within the framework of biopolitics. The real radical move is asking questions about the biopolitics, asking questions about the normalization. Okay. I think that's it. Okay. I'm going to post this final video now, hoping that you will have some ideas for possible essay topics. I'll wait a few days, perhaps until the end of the day on Monday. If at that point I have received, by the way, there are already on Moodle a couple of essay topics suggested by one of your fellow students. So that those two will definitely become part of the topics that I'll publish on Moodle. Please do. I would be hugely grateful for feedback. Just kind of on a personal note, lecturing to a computer screen and to a wall that I see there behind this computer screen is not such huge fun. It's much more fun to have actual people. So I would appreciate it if you come up with a few essay topics or with some feedback, so that we can then move to the final phase, if you will, of this module, which is have you write the final essay and my, of course, marking them. One possibility that I already mentioned to you in the last class is this: if some of you, by the way, even 2 or 3 are enough, find it useful, we could have a Teams class. That is to say, we could meet, okay, on Friday when we would normally have class. We meet at 10, we have a Teams discussion, kind of open forum. Questions about Foucault, questions about the essays, concerns that you may have about the essays. You can guide me in terms of the essays in which you would be interested. Look, many thanks. Hope you're doing well. I hope you've enjoyed reading Foucault and the history of sexuality. And so I look forward now to the final phase of the module, namely your essays. Bye-bye.